Thank you for joining us tonight. You're catching us in the middle of a season and series that we call Eastertide. Eastertide is the 50-day celebration of the resurrection of Jesus Christ and all the benefits and blessings therein. The redemption of the world by our Lord Jesus Christ, the hope of glory, and God's means of grace in the world. It's a 50-day celebration of a persistent hope, a courageous celebration, not one that is naive or aloof, but one that recognizes there are challenges and deficiencies all around us, and we celebrate anyways. It is a time to celebrate the welling and swelling of God's deep mercies for us throughout this entire season. So that is why we are here tonight. We're going to jump straight into our teaching text tonight. Throughout the series of Eastertide, we are taking a look at stories of Jesus from the resurrection to the ascension. So we're going to begin tonight in Luke chapter 24. It is commonly known as the road to Emmaus.
Luke 24, 13 through 35. Now that same day, 2 of them were going to a village called Emmaus, about 7 miles from Jerusalem. They were talking with each other about everything that had happened. As they talked and discussed these things with each other, Jesus himself came up and walked along with them, but they were kept from recognizing him. He asked them, "What are you discussing together as you walk along?" They stood still, their faces downcast. One of them, named Cleopas, asked him, "Are you the only one visiting Jerusalem who does not know the things that have happened there in these days?" "What things?" he asked. "About Jesus of Nazareth," they replied. "He was a prophet, powerful in word and deed before God and all people. The chief priests and our rulers handed him over to be sentenced to death, and they crucified him. But we had hoped that he was the one who was going to redeem Israel. And what is more, it is the 3rd day since all this took place. In addition, some of our women amazed us. They went to the tomb early this morning, but didn't find his body. They came and told us that they had seen a vision of angels, who said he was alive. Then some of our companions went to the tomb and found it just as the women had said, but they did not see Jesus." He said to them, "How foolish are you, and how slow to believe all the things that the prophets have spoken? Did not the Messiah have to suffer these things and then enter his glory?" And beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he explained to them what was said in all the scriptures concerning himself. As they approached the village to which they were going, Jesus continued on as if he was going farther. But they urged him strongly, "Stay with us, for it is nearly evening, the day is almost over." So he went in to stay with them. And he was at the table with them. He took bread, gave thanks, broke it, and began to give it to them. Then their eyes were opened, and they recognized him, and he disappeared from their sight. They asked each other, "Were not our hearts burning within us while he talked with us on the road, and opened the scriptures to us?" They got up and returned at once to Jerusalem. There they found the 11, and those with them, assembled together and saying, "It is true, the Lord has risen and has appeared to Simon." Then the 2 told what had happened on the way and how Jesus was recognized by them when he broke the bread. This is the word of the Lord.
Thanks for listening to the Sacred Grace podcast. Due to a recording difficulty, there's a short gap between the teaching text and where the sermon resumes.
But how are we going to buy food? And I was like, you don't need food to plant a church. It doesn't matter. We're going to be fine, and that's not true. You do need food to plant a church. But that was one of many questions that we were asking at the beginning. Is this going to work? Or is this a really good idea? Is it okay to plant a church that has such a specific focus on a specific place? Doesn't that exclude people? Is that a good idea or a bad idea? Will people catch on to that and be energized by that, or will they be turned off by that? We weren't sure. And to some extent, some of the questions we were asking at the beginning, some of the verdicts are still out on those. We're still finding those things out because we're only 2 years in. But we've learned a lot over the time. One of the things we've learned is some of the relationships and interactions that we had at the very beginning held a tremendous amount of significance, and we didn't know it at the time. Some of the neighbors, some of the politicians, some of the business owners that we were meeting at the very beginning, we had no idea would become allies and supporters and major players in what this church is. In some ways, some of the people that we met at the beginning are the reason why this church is still what it is and continues to grow, because of those relationships, having no idea what they were. Oftentimes, we're staring something straight in the face that has a tremendous amount of significance, and we have no idea at the time. The same goes for our house. Kevin mentioned it during Key Info. The house that we live in today, we had no idea the first time that we saw it that it would be the house that we would live in, the place where we would raise our family, and the place that would play such a significant role in us planting this church. We walked almost every block in this neighborhood over the course of a year praying that God would provide a house for us. And I remember on more than one occasion walking by that house and saying, man, that's a cool house. Sure wish it was on the market. I wish there was a for sale sign out front. Probably couldn't afford it anyways, but man, we wish that house was on the market. Little did we know that we would buy that house without it ever going on the market, and we'd buy it for under market value, and it would be only a block away from this church. We have hosted over the past 18 months literally hundreds of people in that home. We've had 4 foster kids in that home, plus our 2 permanent kids, plus just anybody and everybody who just kind of like finds their way there. That home has already, in 18 months, played a significant role in the planting of this church here. But we had no idea that it would hold that significance the first time that we saw it. In the living room of that home, there is a baby grand piano. And most people comment on it when they see it because it's a baby grand piano. It's sort of an unusual thing to see in somebody's living room, especially a living room that's like not that big. But there it is, and people ask about it. Oh, and they always ask me if I'm the musician, which is hilarious because I'm not. My wife is. And so I quickly, defer the conversation to her. But if you look a little closer at the piano, it's actually got a lot of nicks and scratches on it. It looks kind of old and dinged up. In fact, a couple of the keys are even chipped. And you might think, well, it's just kind of an old piano. Like, it looks nice, but it's sort of an old piano. But if you ask more questions about it, you would know that it's over 60 years old, and it belonged to Julie's great-grandfather. He was the original owner of it, and it's been passed down from generation to generation. The storied layers of that piece of musical equipment, you could talk about those for days and days. In fact, some of the nicks and scratches that you would see on that piano, especially on that one piece of wood that sits right above the keys and right below the music, are actually from little kid Julie's teeth marks when she got frustrated that she was not able to complete a piece perfectly. She would bite the top of it in frustration. That's the sort of thing that lives in that piano, those sort of stories. If you were to wander into our garage, you'd see a lot of kids' toys, you'd see our cars, you'd see some old furniture, and you would see a bunch of bikes. In particular, you would see my road bike, which looks like any other road bike. It's actually a very ordinary-looking bike. But if you were to ask more questions about it, we start talking about that bike. Over the course of 2 years, I put 4,000 miles on that bike. I rode that bike from Reno to Seattle over the course of 10 days. And then the following year, I rode it all around the state of Colorado, 750 miles, also over the course of 10 days. That bike, if it could talk, would probably say, I'm tired. But it has a lot of stories in it. There's a lot of significance wrapped up in that 2-wheel, super simple machine. And I think that's exactly what's happening in the story that Erica just read. It's what's unfolding between these people and Jesus. They have no idea the significance of the circumstances. This is a very ordinary walk from Jerusalem back home to Emmaus. They spent all this time in Jerusalem. Who knows why they were there? Perhaps they were there for the crucifixion. Maybe they were witnesses to it, but either way, they're on their way back. And they're on their way back home. And the stranger approaches them and says, what is it that you all are talking about? And it's clear in the text that they're having a rather angsty conversation. There's a lot of maybe stress in the conversation. There's a Greek word in there specifically that implies that they're kind of intense in the way they're talking about this. And this stranger comes up and says, what is it that you're talking about? And they stop. It says they actually stop. And with their face downcast, they go, are you the only one who doesn't know? It would be like going up to somebody in November 2016 and saying, what is it that you all are talking about? Well, everybody was talking about the same thing in the United States and maybe around the world, that there was a billionaire real estate mogul, reality TV star that became president. Everybody was talking. You didn't have to ask, what are you talking about? Everybody knew what everybody was talking about at that time. And in the same case, they look at Jesus and they go, how do you not know? The whole world, it seems like, is talking about the fact that Jesus was alive and then he's dead, and then we're not so sure where his body is, which creates a lot of anxiety in all of his followers. I've said it before that one of the key components, one of the things that was most necessary for the Messiah is that he be not dead. And so it was very difficult for them to process the fact that this Messiah was now dead, and then his body was missing. They weren't really sure what to do with that. And so they continue down the road and they explain to Jesus all the things that have come to pass. And now it's his turn to give them a hard time. And he says, you fools, did you not know that all of this had to happen in order for the prophets and the things that were spoken in Scripture to be fulfilled? And then he proceeds to unpack essentially what we call our Old Testament to them over the course of this walk. Explains everything, that the Messiah was to come and to suffer. That was a part of the plan from the beginning. God didn't reactionarily create a situation in which the Messiah would suffer, but rather the Messiah was always to suffer. That was part of the plan from the beginning. And he explains to them that these things were necessary. These things had to happen. And at the end of this conversation, they arrive in Emmaus, where they call their home, and they are at probably the doorstep of their home, and Jesus continues to walk on. He continues to go on as if he's going to go on to somewhere else. And put yourself in the shoes of the people that are with Jesus for a second. 7-mile journey, which is about the same as leaving this building right now and heading towards Coors Field, between here and Coors Field. And it's not like you're walking along the Platte River Trail or something like that in your like Nike walking shoes. It's like walking along a rocky dirt road in whatever first century footwear there was, okay? So like probably fairly primitive sandals of some kind. You're tired from your journey. You're emotionally beat up because your friend and the person you were following is dead and his body is missing. And for some reason, you have a sense that you should invite this person in. A weird moment of hospitality, like I need to make an invitation to this complete stranger who has called me a name already, foolish, and I don't know who this person is, but I should invite him in. And so Jesus continues to walk, and someone in the doorway turns to him and says, "Hey, do you want to have dinner with us?" And Jesus goes, "Sure," and changes his mind. And I would like to submit that that is by far the most remarkable point of this entire story. In fact, if that moment doesn't happen, this story doesn't make it into the New Testament. I'd bet my next paycheck on it. That Luke would have no reason to spill the ink, Luke would have no reason to waste the paper on this story if it doesn't hinge on this one moment where Jesus' mind is changed by hospitality. Somebody extends an invitation and says, "Did you want to come in and have a meal with us?" And he goes, "Sure." And he comes in, and then following that is the second most remarkable part of this entire story, when the guest becomes the host. Again, put yourself into the shoes of the host. You sit at the table, and you grab bread off of a shelf, and you grab wine out of a cabinet, and you put it on the table like you would normally for a meal, and you're about to break it, and you're about to pour the wine into glasses and pass it around, and Jesus reaches across the table and says, no, I'll do that. Breaks the bread, and pours the wine, and passes it out, and becomes the host. In a very unexpected turn of events, an unexpected reciprocity of hospitality. Hospitality is extended to Jesus. He reciprocates that hospitality to his hosts and becomes the host himself in that moment, in a really beautiful experience around a table. I'd like to submit to you that maybe the thing that is most prevalent in the season of Eastertide is hospitality. It is an Eastertide priority. It is something that is pervasive throughout the season of Eastertide. And if there was ever a time of year where we ratcheted up our hospitality, even to strangers, people we don't know, it is during the season of Eastertide. Eugene Peterson writes this in his book about resurrection. A culture of inhospitality forebodes a culture of resurrection famine. A culture of inhospitality forebodes a culture of resurrection famine. A culture of resurrection abundance, however, is one in which hospitality and invitation into the ordinary abound. The invitation that is extended to Jesus after the long walk from Jerusalem to Emmaus is not to something extravagant. They're saying, would you come? We're tired and we're dirty and we really just want to watch like New Girl on Netflix and drink this bottle of wine, but we're not going to do that. We're going to invite you in, and we're going to ask if you would just come and be a part of this moment with us, as weird and as ordinary and as mundane as it actually is. Would you come and be a part of this with us? It's an invitation into the ordinary. The resurrection gave way to extraordinary experiences in the midst of ordinary circumstances. Here's what I'm not saying. I am not saying that we are to host more dinner parties because you just never know when Jesus is going to show up. I'm not saying that, to be very clear. So if you're thinking that, stop. What I am saying is, as I said a second ago, the resurrection gave way to extraordinary experiences in the midst of ordinary circumstances. Without resurrection, the incarnation stops. Without resurrection, incarnation has a shelf life, in fact, and eventually goes bad. It lasts for 33 years, and then it gets stale and moldy, and then it goes bad. I'd like to propose to you that there are a few major events throughout human history in which God reached down and became personal and intimate in really, really profound ways. The first is in the giving of the law, when God said to his people, this is how I'm going to build you from nothing to something, from an oppressed people to a flourishing people. The second is through the prophets, when he said, I'm going to speak to you through you. I'm going to tell you unpopular things that you don't want to hear through your own people. The third is the incarnation. The fourth is Pentecost. The incarnation being God in flesh moves into the neighborhood, and Pentecost being God in spirit moves into our souls. I would say those four events are among, if not the most intimate and profound ways in which God has reached out to his people. And if there was one of those four that was to bubble to the surface, it would be incarnation. And apart from the resurrection, apart from this little season called Eastertide, apart from this amazing event where somebody went from being alive to dead to not dead, apart from that, incarnation has a shelf life. Incarnation lasts for about 33 years, and then it goes moldy and stale, and it goes away. But because of the resurrection, it continues on. Because of the resurrection, God continues to be extremely intimately and profoundly involved in our lives on a day-to-day basis, making the mundane and the ordinary extraordinary, making the maybe strange or even regular things of our lives something special, something in which he can move and act. This is what we've been practicing throughout our Eastertide happy hour, just telling ordinary stories and celebrating the way that God is moving in those experiences. One of the ways that our church believes that God works in extraordinary ways is around tables. We gather around tables a lot, if you haven't caught on to that yet. I'll tell you about an extraordinary experience around a table I had about 6 years ago. It took place at Moe's Barbecue right over here. If you like bowling and if you like beer and if you like barbecue, then you should go over there because it's a wonderful place. When I walk out of my house in the morning, oftentimes at 7 a.m., I can smell them smoking meat, which is the worst best because I want it, but it's 7 o'clock in the morning and you can't have both at the same time. It's an amazing thing and it's an amazing place. But right above the bowling area, there's a little arcade area with a couple bistro tables, and my kids love running up and down those stairs. But about 6 or 7 years ago, there was a guy named Adam who approached me and said, "Hey, we need to talk." Adam was a self-identified atheist, and he really didn't believe there was a God, and he didn't really think conversations about God made any sense, except for the fact that he had met a girl that he thought was pretty, and she was a Christian. And he thought, if I have a shot with this girl, I need to ask some of these questions and see if there is some kind of answer for these. And so over the course of 20 to 25 very ordinary meals together, we went question by question. And most of the questions he asked, I said, I don't know. These weren't like exciting where I just had these revelations and I could just solve all the problems. That wasn't one of those scenarios. It was really ordinary meals together where I said, I don't know a lot. But he got to get a lot of these questions off his chest. And for some reason, on the 26th meal or whatever it was, we're sitting around one of those little bistro tables in the arcade area of Moe's Barbecue. And for some reason, that was the night where he decided that he was ready to change everything in his life and follow the way of Jesus. He decided that that was the night, in a very ordinary bar, in a very ordinary scenario that we had been in many, many times. He decided to open his eyes to the fact that Jesus was intimately present, not just in his life, but in the world all around him. The resurrection was something that he could grab onto and hold onto and experience himself. And it was in that moment, in that dirty bar on the second level of Moe's Barbecue, that his eternity changed. Because he was willing to open his eyes and recognize the fact that resurrection is something that is available to you and me. We have these table groups around the parish, which are other ways in which people can interact with each other and have meals together and have some meaningful conversation. And you can ask any table group participant in this room or any table group host in this room, what makes those table groups so special? And they'll be like, what do you mean? Because they're not these like extraordinary, extravagant, amazing things. They're actually really, really simple. But yet on a weekly basis, I hear from a participant or a host of one of our table groups telling me something special that happened. Because they're actually really, really ordinary until they're not. They're really, really ordinary until something shifts in the conversation and somebody makes a decision. Maybe an eternity changes, maybe just a Monday changes. But something changes and shifts. Because people are willing to recognize the fact and accept the fact that even in the ordinary, God is doing extremely extraordinary things. And really, I think we can trace all of that back to the resurrection. The resurrection gave way to extraordinary experiences in the midst of ordinary circumstances. One of the many tables that we gather around as a community is called the communion table. It's a table that we gather around kind of figuratively, and we experience bread and wine, very similar to the bread and wine that these people experienced with Jesus together after their journey from Jerusalem to Emmaus. Sitting together, realizing the significance of the moment, in a really powerful and profound way. And we practice that every single week. And we want that to be a family affair. We want you to feel welcome to check your kids out of either class that they're in and invite them in to come be a part of this. If you're not comfortable with them taking the elements because of their age or because of their experience with God, that's completely okay. But we encourage you to consider checking them out anyways so that they can see the participation in the communion table. We believe that modeling things for our kids is one of the best ways that we can show them how to follow the way of Jesus. So if you'd like to do that in a minute, we're going to pray through our prayer of lament and confession leading up to our prayer of celebration. And so while we're doing that, it's probably a good time for you to go and check out your kids if you would like. Eastertide is the season for courageous celebration, which means that we must be brave enough to recognize some of the pain and suffering around us so that our celebration isn't naive or aloof. Would you join me now in a prayer of lament, followed by a prayer of confession, where we take a moment to recognize that the things in the world around us are not all that they should be. And then we confess some of the ways in which we've been complicit towards those things, some of the ways in which we have turned against the ways of God and been disobedient. And we'll follow that by our time of communion and a great Eastertide celebration. Would you join me in prayer? God of grace, you have always called your people to weep with those who weep and mourn with those who mourn. We join our voices together today in lament, confession, and celebration for all that has been done and all that remains undone. The effects of sin and brokenness are deep and wide. Racism, sexism, abuse, economic disparity, slavery, and oppression of every kind. Let us pause for a moment for an honest audit of societal and cultural brokenness. May your grace and love heal with greater depth and width than any evil thing created or allowed by us. Lord, have mercy. We confess that we have sinned against you, our neighbors, friends, family, and strangers by what we have done and what we have left undone. Let us pause for a moment to confess these things to God, to make an honest audit of our deeds. May your grace and love fill us and make us whole in spite of our propensity towards disobedience. Lord, have mercy. We're now going to take part in communion, but we're doing it a little bit differently in Eastertide as it is a time for celebration. You'll notice as you get the communion elements that the juice and the wine are in small glasses. We believe that this is a season for toasts, and so I hope that at some point you choose to clink your glass with somebody nearby. There should be a lot more clinking of glasses as we think upon the way in which the resurrection continues to be all around us and to fill us with hope and to fill us with courage. And so in a moment, after I explain what we're doing, if you'd just kind of come down the center aisle and come to either one of these tables here and grab the bread and the wine and return to your seat without consuming them, just hold them in your hand. Similar to the night that Jesus was with those friends from Emmaus, he was with some friends prior to his crucifixion. And he was around a table, and he took bread and he broke it, and he said, "This is my body broken for you." And then he poured wine in a glass, and he passed it around. He said, "This is my blood poured out for you. It's a new covenant for the forgiveness of sins." And I'm convinced that in that moment, his disciples were at least confused, if not somewhat dismissive, like not really sure what's going on. And that might describe your situation right now. Not so sure what's going on spiritually. Well, what is it that God is actually doing? Maybe you feel far from God. Maybe you feel close to God. But communion is a time in which we submit ourselves to the possibility that God is here and that God loves you deeply. And that in the resurrection, he displayed that perhaps more profoundly than in any other way throughout human history.